thank you so much, not only for the introduction, but for years of friendship and support. And like Hernan mentioned, SCI-Arc is really a very, very dear place to me, not only because I've taught here a number of times, but because a lot of colleagues and friends that I really respect and love teach here, and you all know who you are. So I never feel like a stranger when I come to SCI-Arc. And I also want to add, I was just at a review with David's class, and just the level of conversation that's happening at SCI-Arc, the kind of inquiry and the way of thinking about design, I think is absolutely remarkable. It's an absolutely wonderful place, and just wanted to get that out. Also, perhaps before I start, the work is something that I've been developing over the past now 8 years. I would say 2016 was the year when I began to think along these terms and develop together with my students techniques that led to this type of work and ultimately to the book. And I did teach at least 2 studios at SCI-Arc where we developed similar set of ideas, which were also very successful. So I truly feel this is a wonderful place to present the book. Yeah, so without further ado, I want to jump into it. I'm going to make this brief. It's Friday, a game is going on and so forth, so I'll try to be concise, which is not one of my strengths, but I'll give it my best. So I stumbled on this quote actually just recently when I was reading a book that I had read when I was a teenager. It's a very famous book by Robert Musil called The Man Without Qualities. And I just sort of stumbled upon this, and I thought this is actually a perfect intro to a lot of what's going on in the book. So let me quickly read this. More precisely, it starts like in the middle of a paragraph. Its original structure was 17th century. The garden and the upper story had an 18th century look, and the facade had been restored and somewhat spoiled in the 19th century, so that the whole thing had a faintly bizarre character, like that of a superimposed photograph. But the general effect was such that people invariably stopped and said, "Oh, look." And I think if I really have to choose, at least right now, kind of one paragraph to describe the work or my interest and how all of this came about, it would be this. That "oh, look," I think is a really fundamental part of how we communicate with the world as designers and architects. And you can see what is being described here is not a masterwork of design. It's not sort of an authored by a particular sort of, in a genius moment of production, but it's something that has grown over time and is sort of put together with all kinds of different parts, and that's exactly the charm of it. And that's really sort of at the kind of base of what this work is about. It deals with what I call the fallout or the residue that all large-scale cosmopolitan cities invariably produce. It's just kind of stuff on different scales, small and large, that just seem curious and kind of, unplanned, accidental, but have some kind of a charm. And I don't know about you, but I constantly sort of see and run into these kinds of architectural conditions. And I personally am interested in them. I think there's something about them, and I felt that nobody has written about it, nobody has really thought about it, and that has sort of triggered the interest in this book. So urban misfits, hybrid artifacts from parts to objects, architectural fantasy, digital collage, and art architecture are things that are undergirding the book, and I'll be quickly touching on those to give you a better idea, what the book is about, and then show a couple images, and then you can have some drinks. So it starts with the idea of the misfit. So the way I define misfit is, I already kind of did it. It's just, kind of incongruent, strange moments in the city where elements have either accrued over a period of time, could be stylistic elements in architecture, could also be something entirely trivial and mundane, like some kind of pipe sticking out next to a window that is highly ornate. And in these juxtapositions, there's just, some kind of architectural quality. So that's what I call, in short, a misfit. And these are some examples, and again, as you can see, some of them are just showing, what I call trivial moments, like the one on the left, or some kind of accidents in construction, like the center, or, something like on the right, where you suddenly have what used to be a portal, but there's no longer a stair, and you don't really know what the meaning of it is. And yet, I think they add something quite interesting to cities. And it's not only interesting, I would argue they are fundamental to cities. We often perceive cities through these kinds of moments, but most of the time we don't think much about them. We just move on and look at like a church or a kind of modernist villa or whatever else is, kind of in that city known as, kind of famous architecture. Here are a couple more examples, and these are actually taken from the book. This is in Istanbul. So the book focuses on 3 cities in particular because that's where I took my students. That's Istanbul, Cairo, and New York. And each of the cities has a very different character, but of course, every one of those cities has these kinds of moments. So just to quickly point out, on the right, you have actually the bottom part, not the actual fountain, but the surrounding of it is 500 years old, and used to be a really old fountain. And then this new fountain was kind of set inside, and then there's some kind of residential building on top with different colors, etc. So this would be a perfect example of a misfit condition. And I love to go around cities and sort of pick them out and take photographs and then sort of think about them. But you have also misfit conditions, the way how I define it, in buildings that were coherently planned and constructed and executed, where things have not accidentally evolved over time, but they're just sort of, in terms of stylistic reference, they're odd, or they're kind of, they're just sort of speak toward a tectonic language that wasn't meant to be. And that would be an example here. That's an old bank in New York. It's now being used for something else, and you see like little portals inside the window and doorways, and everything is just kind of off kilter and no longer functions, right? So the idea isn't the function or the program of these kinds of moments, but that they become some kind of, well, ornament isn't the right word, but some kind of odd additional quality to the building itself. That led me to the idea to think of the city as a depository of objects. Graham is sitting here in the first row, so I have to salute him for introducing a very sophisticated set of ideas on objects. And I read many of his books and had many conversations, and there's a lot of his thinking that I translated in this approach. And one of them is to think of the city not how it has been done usually in a traditional sense. There are, of course, many different traditions how to think about the city. But I don't think there are many theories on the city where you just think of it as a depository of objects with no hierarchies, at least no preconceived hierarchies. Instead, what if we think of it as just objects? And at any given moment in time, they have a potential to organize themselves in vis-a-vis other kinds of objects anew. So when you look at this very purposefully, you see small and large architectural elements, infrastructure, buildings, ornaments, pipes. So there's no discrimination what actually is defined as an object, because all these things are material, all of them exist in the city, and therefore they're fair game to be used as hybrid architecture, which is basically the second step. So if the analysis and the identification is about finding misfits, the design part is to turn them into hybrids or hybrid artifacts, hybrid architecture. I use all those terms exchangeably. So These are some examples. The way how we go about this kind of process is documentation, like of identified misfit conditions that the students or I think are interesting, modeling, and then sort of like that's the beginning of the design, and then, you know, further steps are being added to them. Often, and the book is structured like that, the way we show these artifacts are vis-a-vis each other, in some cases very recognizable in terms of the architectural context, and in other cases, like what you see on the left, for instance, rather obscure. And again, to me, that's one of the exciting elements of experiencing cities. Not everything is obvious, not everything is clear in the way how we perceive it. Like I said before, there's also a kind of sort of rejection of thinking of these objects in regard to a preconceived value, like old is better or old is worse, or none of that, right? So the depository of object really means that everything starts on the same footing and is just being investigated towards its potential to hybridize in interesting ways. So, you know, something like this, an existing strange condition in the city, can trigger some kind of interpretation in a slightly different way along the same wall, like what you see on the right. There's also an interest in looking at the city in two very particular formats or perspectives, and one is a sort of, by now, classic chunk model, the free-floating object rendering that's being decontextualized and modeled and sort of out here, and then a kind of a full bleed image which shows a condition within the object right in front of you. And I like this way of representation because I think what we see on the right is often how we experience the city. You know, it's like right on, we turn a corner, we see something that strikes our interest, and either beautiful or bizarre or strange or whatever else. And then we never, ever perceive a city like this, right? So that's a complete artifice in terms of, yes, we would be inside or we'd be on top, but we would never be able to actually take architecture or part of the city out and be able to look at it from all sides. So I like this combination, and again, if you look at the book, you see a lot of pages are structured exactly like this, in order to sort of find something in that condition that is unique or particular. From parts to objects, I think to me, this is also something that has quite a bit to do with the definition of, Harman's ideas of object, in the sense that when we look at architecture, there's this classic notion that there are no objects. Architecture may be seen as an object as the building, but when we talk about it, it's usually components and parts, right? And there's a long tradition. Building is the whole, and it's made out of parts. And as Alberti famously stated, beauty is defined as a harmonious interplay between parts and the whole. So I find this incredibly limiting. And I think when you, again, look at the modern city or the contemporary city, there's very little of that. There's very little of any type of definition of harmony along the lines of Alberti. And you could say, well, why would there be? That guy lived 500 years ago. But we still often operate under the same kind of notion. Good architecture is something where you really figure out how all the parts work together beautifully. Well, the architecture of hybrids is almost the exact opposite. It's trying to make harmonious what is not harmonious, right? Is trying to make things come together and fit together that do not belong together, were never meant to belong together, right? So it really looks at it from a different point of view. So to get rid of the hierarchy of parts to whole and just say, well, all of these are objects, and therefore they can communicate in new ways outside of the hierarchy of whole to parts, I think is a really important prerequisite for this work. So you see some examples, and again, I will not venture into explaining to you exactly what they are. I think you'll just get the sense of it when you look at the images, when they repeat. I do want to say a couple things to this one. This is actually one of the Cairo projects, and there is definitely a part in this work that cares about the place. But the argument is also to say every place has similar conditions. So the projects are unique and they reflect their environment, but the idea is not regional in any sense of that word. Right? It can really be applied to every place. That really is the point. So this is like a highway in Cairo, which is cutting through a formerly cohesive neighborhood, and it's split it in two parts, and then people on both sides are trying to make sense of it. And it was like the sort of development where workers on the street produce these rosettes and other kind of ornaments and sell them, and they use the kind of wall as a place to display these plaster rosettes. And so the students began to kind of work with this and develop these sort of fictitious ornaments that only take components or objects that are on site, like piping, these rosettes, etc. And then that turns into a kind of local type of ornament. So a lot of the work is developing along those lines. I mean, these are just bits and pieces of bridges. That's another interesting part in Cairo. You have a lot of bridges. Obviously, it's along the Nile, but wherever the bridges land, you have complete chaos. So they cut deep into the city. Nobody has really figured out how to get traffic around or pedestrians. So these projects developed, new versions of dealing with that chaos and creating architectural opportunities from that. Another kind of architectural fantasy, this is something that relates to the type of presentation. So I talked a little bit about the kind of image and object and artifact conditions. But there's something else that I think is important in the work, and that's what is the genre? What is the genre of representation? And I was asked that question early on when I was working on the book by a friend of mine. And I kept thinking about it, and I realized it's basically fantasy, right? And there is like this long tradition of architectural fantasy where fantasy doesn't mean you make something up. It just means you use real conditions and you sort of crossbreed them with fictional conditions, right? I mean, that's sort of, to me, what is really interesting. So the Capriccio, for instance, would be one such example. These are paintings, mostly late 17th and then 18th and 19th century. Piranesi is one of the most important artists in this particular genre, where you come up with these fictitious agglomerations, but they're being put together with architectural components, elements that actually are real. But they're, of course, not real in the way they come together. So to me, that is very close to the kind of object renderings, the chunk models that we have been developing. They have a lot of real pieces, but the way how we put them together and present them as these floating elements, I think follows the notion of the Capriccio, and perhaps even more closely that of the Rocaille. The Rocaille is this interesting artifact that was developed as actually the name giver to the age of Rococo. And it's, again, you can see a beautiful example by Mondon on the right. What is it, right? I mean, is it nature? Is it artifice? Is it architecture? It's all those things. And perhaps most importantly, you always have people in and around it. So it's a story. It's a fiction that people can involve. In this particular case, it's some kind of love story that is either unfolding or has tragically ended, I guess. But the relationship that the architectural kind of artifice plays in the center, how it goes from something exterior to something interior on the bottom, these are all kind of characteristics that I think are super interesting. And that, to me, makes the rocaille still a very contemporary architectural artifact. So these would be, kind of precedents. If I were to pick them, I would go back 200 years, 300 years, and pick the rocaille and the capriccio. So you can see when you look at these now, after seeing the other images, what, how I'm thinking about this. Then digital collage is actually something that David has asked me a number of times. He would always say, well, you're collaging, right? That's what you're doing. You're kind of collaging. And we would have these conversations over years. And I was like, not really. But in a way, of course, he's right. It's a collage in the sense that you pick different elements and you just let them collide. I may just add to that, the difference in this particular case is how we're fusing the elements into a seemingly single coherent condition, right? So it's perhaps a different expression of the technique of collage. Of course, it's three-dimensional, it's digital. So in that sense, it's quite different. But that may be another, kind of artistic precedent to the work. So these are some, again, double pages that were taken in Istanbul, classic sort of misfit condition, kind of a Roman or Byzantine arch that is sort of cut by a 1950s residential home. And then the work is sort of starting from there. So the friction, the tension, the collision is being sort of picked up and then modeled. The textures, the colors that are in the context, in the surroundings, are being brought back into the project, and they sort of enrich the object. And then from there, the project grows, which is also very much how the rocaille works, by the way. The rocaille started as an artifice and then went into frames and furniture, and from furniture into interiors, and finally into buildings. As far as I'm concerned, it's the only other approach to architecture where you don't start with the building as a concept and then go to the detail, but you start with a smaller object and then you go upward. And I'm just fascinated by that as well. Those are some examples. So I'm just going to show a few examples from each of these cities to, I guess, give you an idea about what is similar, but then also what is different. The Istanbul chapter I titled Unscripted Immediacies of Past, Present, and Future. I could have used the same title for sure for Cairo as well. In that sense, both cities are very similar. There is an incredible rich repertoire of buildings, architecture, artifacts, ornaments, and they all happen at the same time. There's like this crazy immediacy. And rather than trying to be a historian and sort of say, well, what came before the other, what has influenced the other, again, the kind of way of thinking with these projects is to do the opposite. Do not think that way and just sort of look how they interact and how they sort of correspond with each other. So this is an old Han. Those of you who know Istanbul, maybe you know it, but it's really hidden. Used to be freestanding at some point in time. It's 400 years old, and then it just started the city grew around it. And so it, in and of itself, is also a misfit condition. So, and in this particular case, what was examined are the relationship of the arches to the columns, and there were all kinds of irregularities. And then those irregularities were being picked up and then further accentuated, and these are some models that are showing this. And then that was being put back into the architecture while everything else was left basically as is. So often in these projects, the presentation ends up being like this as well. I mean, this would be the immersive frontal view. Another example is an old dry dock, which was originally built in the 16th century, but then renewed over and over. This version is, I think, from the early 20th century. And there are all kinds of machinic, but also ornamental and cultural components to it. and a lot of pollution, which has changed the coloration of the dry dock with a lot of, kind of just oil and moss and algae, and you can see that on the left-hand side. So in these projects, we are kind of trying to work with that material residue as well and sort of make that part of the architecture as well as some kind of coloration or texture and color, create a sort of archaeological ruinous architecture. This was a garden project. I'm just saying that because we talked about gardens a lot today in David's class. There's also this beautiful art of water painting. Originally it's Persian as far as I know, but the Ottomans used it a lot. It's called ebru. You basically paint color on water. So the idea of the flow and, what was basically this kind of toxic waste and coloration was then translated into, some kind of landscape ebru color painting. In Cairo, we had a very, very different problem to look at. We looked at informal settlements. We were invited to look at those. It wasn't even our choice. And one thing we realized when you look at these kinds of conditions, and we recognize something like that as informal settlements, unfinished buildings, unsafe, problematic, hygiene problems, etc. But if you forget all that, and if you actually just take individual buildings and you model them and you render them in a neutral color like white, what we realize is they suddenly look like examples of classical modernist architecture. So we said, all right, we're going to call this studio, an asset architecture for informal settlements, and we will just tweak these existing types. Of course, they aren't really types, but they have become types in some way. And we will just give them names, and they will become part of a kind of a modernist catalog. So you have the pilotis house, which is reminiscent of, Corbusier would do in the 20s. But we had also examples where the workers in these informal settlements, the most famous of those is run by the Coptic population in Cairo, the Zabalin. They're collecting trash and they're recycling it in their neighborhood. So they have these kinds of conveyor belts and systems of recycling, but they're just in bits and pieces. So this house, for instance, is sort of a hybrid that is growing from integrating the recycling production into the building directly and making it part of it. New York, completely different story. But what is interesting about New York, or we looked at a number of different problems, but I'm showing one in particular, are these old bank buildings. They were mostly produced between 1900 and the Great Depression, 1929. And it was a time where almost everybody opened a bank in New York. And you have literally dozens, if not hundreds of these. And most of them are, following some kind of classical idea of architecture. Some of them are nouveau and have other stylistic markers. But of course, they weren't quote-unquote real in the sense that they were taking the type from where it originated and were using it accordingly. They were just thinking, well, it's a bank and it needs to project power and safety. So what architecture style does that best? Classicism. And then almost all of them went bankrupt in 1929. And very few were used afterwards as banks. So most of them today, when you go there, are things like Dwayne Reed's and supermarkets and just very sort of mundane programs. And again, to me, that's fascinating. It's a different type of hybridization, but it's not only the hybrid between the program and the architecture itself, but also, how that changes our perception to something that we would usually perceive as monumental or iconic, right? So there's an iconic Dwayne Reed. This is kind of an interesting or strange concept. So here, just like basically what we did in the informal settlements in Cairo, we just looked at the buildings and modeled them. So we did the same in New York, and we discovered all kinds of interesting relationships. This particular one, those of you who know New York maybe recognize it, it's actually on Canal Street and Broadway, and it connects to the subway. So this particular artifact was kind of dealing with the subway connectioning and turning it into a relationship to the bank building and the facade. And then how the project would further develop, it doesn't stop here. This is kind of where I stop. The project keeps going, right? And in the end, you have a project. But I think for the argument of the book and for my argument in regard to how we perceive cities and what hybrids and misfits are, it would be a disservice to show the whole project. It makes more sense to show these momentary hybrid artifact conditions. There's also something else that's really interesting that's happening on Canal Street, and that's counterfeit fashion. So if you want to buy a fake Gucci bag or some kind of strange Nike shoes or Adidas that really don't exist, but they do exist, you go to Canal Street. And that's sort of the spirit of these artifacts. Again, it's sort of making odd relationships come to fruition and then sort of just work it out and see where it leads you. So the type of ornamentation you see on the left, for instance, there, of course, that's what we designed, but there have been taken elements from the architecture that already exists. So the kind of, individual ornaments, the tiling, the color, all of them are in the building. They have been just recomposed. This is another very, very famous building where we sort of like, went into the inside, and these yellow tubes are, what are those called? Vacuum tubes. So this used to be the way how people would communicate in the buildings all the way up until the 1940s and 50s. Those things that you just have a message and the vacuum just shoots it through the building. And so these students decided to kind of keep that and just work off of it and basically create a new infrastructure inside this building. And they're also feeding, into these big glass terrariums, which are taking up the interior space, which is humongous, enormous in that space. So it's a reprogramming, is a kind of a reuse of existing architectural conditions that sometimes are very small in the corner, like ornaments and tiling, and sometimes rather radical and large in the way they have been expressed. I think this is the last one I'm showing. This is actually the very top portion of an insurance building that was built, I think, in 1919. And here the idea, and you can perhaps see it in this rendering, was to turn this into a large recycling unit. So basically the insurance has moved out. Like in the case of all these financial institutions, what used to be sort of the representational content of these buildings has been completely flipped. So they need new meaning, they need new kind of content. So that's what most of these New York projects are about. So this would be the part that was inserted, and it's taking advantage of the mechanical systems and the circulatory systems of the building and sort of changing it into a recycling machine. The kind of funnels you see would be receiving, actually, it's not just recycling. I don't know if you know this, but there's a ton of, goods that Amazon sells that are being returned and they cannot be restocked. I don't know if you're aware of this, really crazy, because restocking fees are actually higher than discarding them. So they're being basically put into landfills. So, the project is taking that notion. Rather than actually landfilling it, what if we sort of recycle them and turn that into a kind of architectural spectacle? That's why part of the building is being opened up so we can see the process. So I want to end quickly with a couple more quotes and then one final slide, sort of a summary. So odd architecture is perhaps what I would call, the kind of desire or the type of work that we're trying to do here. And if you look at the Oxford Dictionary definition, odd just means different from what is usual or expected, or simply what is strange. And then there is Donna Haraway, one of my favorite writers and thinkers, and she coined the term odd-kin. And she does not talk about buildings when she uses the word odd-kin. She talks about organisms, and she makes an ecological argument that we have to sort of strike kinship with the thing that is odd. So in other words, not drawn to the thing that already belongs to us, but kind of like go across a different type of threshold. And I really love that idea, and I was always wondering, well, how would that translate into architecture? And I think, you know, a lot of the notions of misfits and hybridizations come from Donna Haraway's notion of, making kinship with the odd. And this is my last slide, so I just want to basically put this up there. This is also, again, a nod to David, because last time I presented this work, we both happened to be at the same place in Austria, in Innsbruck. And we talked about the aspect of pathology, you know, that there's just something about, understanding anomaly as a way of diagnosing what is wrong with somebody. And if there's perhaps a way of thinking about cities in a similar way, but not in terms of the city is sick because it's producing misfits and how can we heal it and get rid of it, which I think is what people usually do, planners, architects, politicians, right? But what if we look at it as some kind of important way of understanding a side of the city that is unique because of these anomalies, right? So I would like to embrace these anomalies because I don't think we can get rid of it. I think that's absolutely naive. We can just ignore them. That's usually what we do. But if we don't ignore them, perhaps it's a new way of thinking about reuse or adaptive reuse, but expanding it to a much larger field. Thank you.